What if I told you that the sun you see is not the first sun humanity knew? Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this question spreading across time zones, whispered in darkness, considered in the violet hour before dawn. Because what we're about to discuss is not a theory, it is a disturbance. Every culture on Earth remembers a time before this sky, not as poetry, as testimony. The Hopi speak of a purple world. The Greeks mourned the death of Kronos, Saturn, the devouring father who ruled a golden age that ended in fire and flood. The Egyptians carved the same story into stone, a primordial epic when the sun never moved, when time itself was different, when the sky was a ladder you could climb. These are not myths, they are scars. Because 10,000 years ago, something changed, not gradually, not peacefully, but in a catastrophic unraveling that rewrote the heavens themselves. If you held the oldest stones now, the ones carved before the flood, you would feel the cold weight of a world that no longer exists. And the question is not why we forgot. The question is, what made us forget? Chapter 1: The Purple Wound. What if I told you that the sun you see is not the first sun humanity knew? Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this question spreading across time zones, whispered in darkness, considered in the violet hour before dawn. Because what we're about to discuss is not a theory, it is a disturbance. Sit with that for a moment. The sun, the one constant in human experience, the thing we build calendars around, the thing we pray to, the thing that has governed every civilization, every harvest, every war, every love story ever lived. That sun, the yellow dwarf star we call Sol, is approximately 4.6 billion years old. It has been burning in more or less the same way for the entire span of Earth's existence. And yet, every culture on Earth remembers a time before this sky, not as poetry, not as allegory, as testimony. The Hopi of the American Southwest speak of the purple world, the first world where the sun did not move and the sky was the color of twilight at all hours. The Greeks mourned the death of Kronos, Saturn, the devouring father who ruled a golden age that ended in fire and flood. The Egyptians carved the same story into stone, a primordial epic called Zep Tepi, the first time when the sun never moved, when time itself was different, when the sky was a ladder you could climb. In Mesopotamia, they called it the Age of the Fixed Sun. In China, the Kingdom of the Pole Star. In Norse mythology, the time before Ragnarok, before the sky itself fell. These are not myths, they are scars. Because somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, something changed, not gradually, not peacefully, not in the slow, comfortable way we imagine geological time, but in a catastrophic unraveling that rewrote the heavens themselves, an event so violent, so disorienting, that human beings have spent the last 10,000 years trying to forget it ever happened. If you held the oldest stones now, the ones carved before the flood, the ones that predate the pyramids by millennia, you would feel the cold weight of a world that no longer exists, a world that looked up and saw a different star, a world that knew a different dawn. They call it the Saturn Theory, the hypothesis of the purple dawn. And the question is not why we forgot. The question is, what made us forget? Let me take you somewhere first, not to a library, not to a university. Those places have already decided what is safe to know. I want to take you to the place where this question lives. It lives in the gap between what we remember and what we're told to remember. It lives in the mythology we've been taught to dismiss as primitive superstition. It lives in the archaeological sites that don't fit the timeline. It lives in the stones that whisper a different history than the one written in textbooks. And it lives in the sky itself. Because here is the anomaly that breaks everything. Brown dwarf stars exist. They are real, documented, observable objects in our universe. They are failed stars, objects too small to sustain hydrogen fusion, like our sun, but too massive to be called planets. They sit in the strange territory between worlds and suns, burning dim and cold, emitting light primarily in the infrared and violet spectrum. They glow purple, not the purple of a sunset, which is sunlight scattered through atmosphere, but the deep, intrinsic purple of an object that is almost a star, an object that burns with its own internal heat, but cannot achieve the brightness of true stellar fusion. And Saturn, the ringed giant, the second largest planet in our solar system, is a sub-brown dwarf. It emits more energy than it receives from the sun, even now. Even in its diminished, captured state, orbiting peacefully in the outer solar system, Saturn radiates 2.5 times more heat than it absorbs. It glows in infrared. It has a remnant heat signature. It is cooling. This is not speculation. This is NASA data. This is thermodynamics. Saturn is not supposed to be this warm, not if it has always been where it is now, locked in a stable orbit a billion kilometers from the sun. There is no mechanism in conventional planetary science to explain why Saturn still burns, unless it once burned brighter, unless it once was something else, unless, for a brief and impossible moment in cosmic history, Saturn was our sun. Let me paint you a picture, not of what we see now, but of what the physics suggests could have existed. Imagine a system, not the solar system we know, but a smaller, stranger configuration. A brown dwarf star, roughly 95 times the mass of Jupiter, glowing with the last embers of deuterium fusion. Around it, in tight, tidally locked orbits, Earth, Mars, Venus, it's perhaps others, a family of worlds circling a dying star. The light would be dim, not bright like our current sun, but persistent, a soft, violet glow that never changes intensity because the star never rises or sets. You would not have day and night. You would have only the eternal dusk, the permanent twilight of a tidally locked world where one hemisphere always faces the star. The sky would be purple, not blue. Blue skies are a product of Rayleigh scattering, the way our current sun's light interacts with nitrogen and oxygen in our atmosphere. But under a brown dwarf emitting primarily in the violet spectrum, the atmospheric scattering would shift. The sky would glow the color of a bruise, the color of a fading wound, and because Earth would be tidally locked, always showing the same face to Saturn, there would be no rotation, no day-night cycle, no concept of sunrise or sunset. The sun would simply be a massive, unmoving disk in the sky, perhaps 10 to 20 times larger than the sun appears now, hanging fixed at the zenith, never moving, never setting, an eternal eye watching over a world that did not spin. If you stood beneath it, you would see a sun that did not move, not in an hour, not in a day, not in a lifetime. And you would think, as every human who has ever lived under such a skies have thought, This is how the universe is supposed to be. But here is where it becomes uncomfortable. Here is where the line between physics and memory begins to blur. Because this is exactly what the myths describe. Not similar, not kind of like what the myths describe. Exactly what the myths describe. The Egyptians spoke of the Zeb Tepi, the first time when the sun did not sail across the sky in the boat of Ra, when the sun was fixed, when the god Atum stood on the primordial mound and the sun did not move. Every Egyptian cosmology begins with this anomaly, a time before time when the celestial order was different. The Hopi described the first world, Tokpela, where the sun was purple and did not cross the sky, where there was no night, where the people lived in perpetual twilight under a sun that stood like a pillar. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Maya, the gods create the world, and the first humans live in a land where there was no sun as yet. The text is explicit. The light existed, but the sun did not move. It was only after the Great Flood, after the world was destroyed and remade, that the sun began to rise and set. The Norse Prose Edda describes a time before the current world order, before the establishment of the cosmic tree Yggdrasil, when the heavens were different. When the god realm of Asgard was connected to Midgard, the world of humans, by a visible physical bridge called the Bifrost, a glowing column, a ladder to heaven. The Greeks mourned the age of Kronos, the rule of Saturn, as a lost golden age. Hesiod writes that during the reign of Kronos, men lived like gods, without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief. And then Kronos was overthrown by Zeus, the sky god, the god of lightning, the god of the current celestial order. And the golden age ended in blood and flood. These are not vague parallels. These are precise, repeated descriptions of the same physical condition: a fixed, unmoving sun, a purple sky, a time before the current cosmic order, a catastrophic transition, a flood, a forgetting. And the question that should disturb you, that should make you look at the night sky differently, is this: how does a global, pre-technological civilization, separated by oceans and millennia, all describe the same impossible sky? Not a golden age, in the vague, metaphorical sense, but a world with specific, testable physical properties. No day-night cycle, no seasons, a fixed celestial object, purple light, stable climate, and then catastrophe. Because there is no way a primitive people should know what a tidally locked planet looks like. There is no way they should be able to describe the light spectrum of a brown dwarf star. There is no way they should all, independently, across continents and centuries, describe the same sky, unless they saw it, unless they lived under it, unless the myths are not myths at all, but the last fragmented memories of a world that existed before this one. If you go outside tonight and look at the sky, you are looking at the second sky. The first sky is gone. It died 10,000 years ago in a catastrophe so complete that we have spent the entirety of recorded history trying to forget it. But the stones remember. The myths remember. The DNA remembers. And deep in the collective unconscious of every human being, buried beneath the noise of modern life, beneath the artificial light and the certainty of calendars, there is a memory of a purple dawn, of a sun that did not move, of a sky that was a ladder, of a world that ended, not in a year, not in a lifetime, but in the violent unraveling of a geological epoch. This is not ancient astronaut theory. This is not pseudoscience. This is catastrophism, the study of how planetary systems can be torn apart and reassembled by gravitational chaos. This is plasma cosmology, the study of how electromagnetic forces can reshape worlds. This is comparative mythology, the study of how human memory encodes trauma. And the trauma is this: we are not living under the first sun, we are living under the second. And everything we think we know about the stability of the cosmos, the permanence of the heavens, the unchanging nature of the sky, all of it is a lie we tell ourselves to feel safe. Because if the sky changed once, it can change again. So tell me, when you look up tonight, what do you see? Do you see the familiar, comforting yellow sun of your childhood? Or do you see something else, something older, something that your ancestors knew and your civilization has forgotten? Do you see the blue sky and think, this is how it has always been? Or do you see the faint, impossible memory of a purple wound, a scar in the firmament where another sun used to be? Not as myth, as memory. Chapter 2: The Fixed Sun. There is a sentence that appears in mythology so often that we have learned to ignore it. The sun stood still, not metaphorically, not as a miracle performed by a god for a single battle or a single prophet, but as a description of how the world was, before it changed, before the flood, before the sky fell. If you read the myths with fresh eyes, if you strip away the theological interpretations and the scholarly dismissals, you will find the same testimony repeated across continents, across millennia, across cultures that had no contact with one another. They all describe a sun that did not move, not a sun that rose and set, not a sun that traced an arc across the sky, but a sun that hung fixed, motionless, eternal, a pillar of light that never wavered. And the question we must ask is not whether this is possible. The question is, why would 40 different cultures, separated by oceans and ice ages, all describe the same impossible celestial configuration, not as a myth, as a memory? Let us begin in Egypt, because Egypt does not begin where we think it begins. The pyramids are not the beginning. The Sphinx is not the beginning. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom are not the beginning. They are already a civilization in decline, already working from blueprints they inherited, already worshiping gods whose origins they themselves did not fully understand. The beginning is Zep Tepi, the first time. Every Egyptian cosmology references this epoch, a time before history, before the dynasties, before the Nile itself took its current course. The pyramid texts carved into stone 4,400 years ago speak of it. The coffin texts repeat it. The Book of the Dead remembers it. And what they describe is this: a time when the sun god Ra did not sail across the sky, when the solar bark, the boat that carries the sun from horizon to horizon, did not yet exist, when the sun was not a traveler, but a presence, fixed, unmoving, a pillar. The god Atum, the self-created one, the primordial deity who preceded even Ra, stands on the Benben, the primordial mound that rises from the waters of chaos. And above him, the sun does not move. It does not rise in the east or set in the west. It simply is. The Egyptians were obsessed with this moment, not as allegory, as history. They built their entire civilization trying to recreate it. The pyramids themselves are representations of the Benben, the sacred mound, the place where earth touched the fixed sun. The Djed pillar, one of the most sacred symbols in Egyptian religion, is not a spine, not a tree. It is a column, a cosmic axis, the thing that connected Earth to the unmoving sky. And then Zeb Tepi ended. The texts are clear. There was a catastrophe, a rebellion of the gods, a flood. And after the flood, the sun began to move. Ra climbed into his solar bark and began the daily journey across the sky, a journey that, before the catastrophe, did not exist. This is not poetry. This is testimony. The Egyptians are describing a transition from one cosmic order to another, from a fixed sun to a moving sun, from a world without day and night to a world with sunrise and sunset. They are describing the day the sky changed. Now cross the ocean, go to the American Southwest, to the mesas where the Hopi have lived for 1,000 years, but whose oral traditions go back much, much further. The Hopi speak of 4 worlds. We are living in the 4th world. But the first world, Tokpela, was different. In Tokpela, the sun was purple, not yellow, not white. Purple, the color of twilight, the color of a dying star. And the sun did not move. The Hopi are explicit about this. In the first world, there was no day and no night. There was only the endless gentle light of a sun that stood like a pillar in the sky. The people did not count days because there were no days to count. Time itself was different. The seasons did not exist. The world was mild, stable, unchanging. And then Tokpela was destroyed. The Hopis say it was destroyed by fire, by the fires from above and below. The sky itself burned. The first world ended, and the people fled into the second world through the Sipapu, the hole in the sky, the tunnel between worlds. And when they emerged, the sun had changed. It moved. It rose and set. The sky was no longer purple. This is the same story, not similar. The same story. A fixed sun, a stable world, a catastrophe, a transition, a new sky. Let us go further, to Scandinavia, to the frozen north, where the Norse carved their myths into rune stones and whispered them through the long winter nights. The Norse speak of Yggdrasil, the world tree. We have been taught to understand this as a metaphor, a poetic image of the interconnectedness of the cosmos. But read the descriptions in the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda carefully. Read what they actually say. Yggdrasil is not invisible. It is not abstract. It is a physical structure, an immense pillar that connects the 9 worlds, that reaches from Midgard, Earth, to Asgard, the realm of the gods. Its roots go down into the underworld. Its branches hold up the sky. And at the top of Yggdrasil, at the crown of the tree, sits an eagle. Some translations say the eagle sees all. Others say the eagle is the sun, or the eye of the sun, watching over the worlds below. A cosmic pillar, a tree that reaches to heaven, a structure connecting Earth to a celestial body that does not move. This is not metaphor. This is description. And the Norse myths are equally clear about what happened next. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the day the world tree trembled and fell, the day the sky itself cracked, the day the sun was swallowed and the world drowned in flood. After Ragnarok, the world is reborn. A new sun rises, the daughter of the old sun. A new cosmic order begins. The same story, the same transition, from a fixed cosmos to a moving one. Let us go to Mesoamerica, to the Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Maya, written in the 16th century but preserving oral traditions that stretch back millennia. The Popol Vuh describes the creation of the world, the making of the first humans, and it is explicit. In the beginning, there was light, but there was no sun that moved across the sky. The text says there was no sun as yet. The light existed, soft, diffuse, unchanging, but the sun did not travel. The first humans lived in this perpetual twilight, in a world where the light never changed intensity, where there was no morning and no evening. And then came the flood. The hero twins descended into the underworld, defeated the lords of death, and when they returned, everything had changed. The gods set the sun in motion for the first time. The text describes the astonishment of the first people when they saw the sun rise, an event they had never witnessed before. Then the sun came up. The animals, small and great, were happy. They all stood up, and they sang for joy. They were overjoyed when the sun came up, not because the sun appeared, but because the sun moved. The Maya are describing the same transition, from a fixed light to a moving sun, from one cosmic order to another. Cross the Pacific, go to China, to the ancient texts of the Shang dynasty, and then earlier. The Chinese speak of the Pole Star Kingdom, an era before the current celestial order, when the universe revolved around a fixed central point. The emperor, in Chinese cosmology, sits at the center of the world, unmoving, just as the pole star sits at the center of the heavens, unmoving. But this is not a description of the North Star as we know it. This is a description of a sun, a central celestial body that did not move. The ancient Chinese called it the supreme ultimate, the cosmic axis around which everything else turned. And Chinese mythology, too, describes a catastrophe, the great flood of Gunyu, the separation of heaven and earth, the day the pillars that held up the sky were broken. The same story. Do you see the pattern? Not vague similarities, not loose parallels, but precise, repeated descriptions of the same physical phenomenon. A sun that did not move, a cosmic pillar connecting earth to the heavens, a stable, unchanging world, and then a catastrophe, a flood, a transition, a new sky. The Egyptians, the Hopi, the Norse, the Maya, the Chinese, the Mesopotamians, the Hindus, the Aboriginals of Australia, the Maori of New Zealand, 40 cultures, 40 testimonies, all describing the same impossible sky. And we have been taught to dismiss this. We have been taught that these are creation myths, that primitive people simply made up stories to explain the world they didn't understand. But that explanation does not work, because these are not creation myths. These are memory myths. They are not explaining how the world began. They are explaining how the world changed. They are not describing the creation of the sun. They are describing the day the sun started to move. And there is only one way a global civilization describes the same astronomical impossibility. They saw it, not as a metaphor, not as a dream, as an event. Chapter 3. The Ladder to Heaven. There is a structure that appears in every ancient civilization. It has different names, different forms, different materials, but it is always the same thing. A ladder, a pillar, a tree, a tower, a mountain, a stairway, something that connects earth to the sky, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but physically, visibly, a structure so massive, so undeniable, that every culture on earth built monuments trying to recreate it. trying to remember it, trying to reach back towards something that was once there and is now gone. We call it the axis mundi, the axis of the world, the cosmic pillar. And we have been taught to understand it as a religious symbol, a metaphor for the connection between the earthly and the divine, between the mortal and the eternal. But what if it was not a symbol? What if it was a description? What if the Tower of Babel, Jacob's ladder, the Jed pillar, the world tree, the stairway to heaven, what if all of these were not myths about what ancient people imagined, but memories of what ancient people saw? Because there is a phenomenon in plasma physics, a documented, observable, repeatable phenomenon that occurs when two celestial bodies with magnetic fields come into close proximity. They connect, not through gravity alone, but through electromagnetic discharge. A visible column of plasma, a glowing, twisting pillar of ionized gas, forms between the two bodies, channeling energy along magnetic field lines. It looks like a ladder. It looks like a tree. It looks like a rope of light stretching from one world to another. And if Earth was once in a close, tidally locked orbit around Saturn, if the two planets were near enough for their magnetospheres to interact, then the sky would not have been empty. There would have been a structure, a visible, physical structure, a column of light reaching from the ground beneath your feet to the unmoving sun above your head. If you stood beneath it, you would see something so vast, so incomprehensible, that you would think it was the spine of the universe itself, not divine, electromagnetic. And one day, the ladder broke. Let us begin with the most famous ladder in Western mythology, Jacob's ladder, Genesis 28:12. Jacob, fleeing from his brother Esau, stops to rest in the wilderness. He lays his head on a stone and dreams. But read the text carefully, because what Jacob sees is not a dream image, not a vision conjured by his unconscious mind. He sees a ladder, sulam in Hebrew, set up on the earth, and the top of it reaches to heaven, and he sees angels ascending and descending on it, not flying, not floating, ascending and descending, using the ladder, moving along a physical structure that connects the ground to the sky. And when Jacob wakes, he does not say, "I had a strange dream." He says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." He marks the spot with the stone he used as a pillow. He calls the place Bethel, the house of God, because he believes he has found the place where earth touches heaven, the place where the ladder still stands. But here is what is strange. Jacob is not the only one who sees a ladder to heaven. The image appears everywhere. In Mesopotamia, the ziggurats, the massive stepped pyramids, were called Temen Anki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. They were not temples in the way we understand temples. They were reconstruction projects. They were humanity's attempt to rebuild the cosmic mountain, the stairway that once connected Earth to the gods. The most famous ziggurat, the Etemenanki of Babylon, is almost certainly the historical basis for the Tower of Babel. And the story of Babel is not about human arrogance. It is about a traumatized civilization trying to rebuild something that was lost, trying to reconnect Earth to a heaven that had moved away. Genesis 11:4, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens." Not reaching toward the heavens. in the heavens, as if the top of the tower was supposed to touch something, as if there was supposed to be something up there to connect to. And God, or the gods, the Elohim, the text uses the plural, comes down and says, "Come, let us go down and confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." The tower is never finished. Humanity scatters. The project is abandoned, but the memory remains. The memory of a time when earth and heaven were connected, when you could climb from one to the other, when there was a ladder. Now go to Egypt, to the Djed pillar. The Djed is one of the oldest and most sacred symbols in Egyptian religion, older than the pyramids, older than the dynastic period, stretching back into the prehistory of the Nile Valley. It appears everywhere, on tomb walls, on amulets, in the hands of pharaohs, in the hieroglyphs for stability and endurance. It looks like a pillar with 4 horizontal bars near the top. Egyptologists have offered many interpretations. It is the spine of Osiris. It is a bundle of grain. It is a stylized tree. But the Egyptians themselves were clear about what it represented. It was the cosmic pillar, the thing that held up the sky, the backbone of the universe. And there was a ceremony, the raising of the Djed, performed at the beginning of every pharaoh's reign and at key moments in the ritual calendar. The pharaoh and the priests would physically raise a massive wooden Djed pillar, lifting it from horizontal to vertical, reenacting the moment when the pillar stood upright, when earth and sky were connected, reenacting a memory. Because the Djed was not always a symbol. The Egyptians believed it had once been real, that there had once been a physical pillar, visible, tangible, undeniable, that connected the primordial mound to the vault of heaven. And when the Djed fell, when the pillar broke, the world ended. The first time ended. Zep Tepi gave way to the age of movement, the age of change, the age of death. The texts are explicit. The fall of the Djed is connected to the death of Osiris, the first death, the event that brought mortality into the world. Before the Djed fell, there was no death. After it fell, everything died. The same story. A cosmic structure, a catastrophe, a transition from one world to another. Go north, to the forests of pre-Christian Germania, where the tribes carved their cosmology into wood and stone. The Irminsul, the Great Pillar. The Saxons worshipped it. Charlemagne destroyed it in 772 CE, cutting down the sacred tree to break the power of the pagan tribes. But before it was destroyed, the Irminsul was described as a massive wooden column that held up the sky, not symbolically. The Germanic peoples believed the sky was a physical thing, a dome, a vault, and that it rested on pillars. The Irminsul was the greatest of these pillars, the axis around which the cosmos turned, and it was connected to Yggdrasil, the world tree of Norse mythology. Yggdrasil, too, was a pillar, a cosmic axis that reached from the underworld to the realm of the gods. Its roots went down into the wells of fate. Its branches held up the heavens. And at the base of Yggdrasil, the Norns, the weavers of destiny, watered the tree every day to keep it alive. Because if the tree died, if the pillar fell, the cosmos would collapse. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, begins when Yggdrasil trembles. The world tree shakes, the pillar weakens, and then the sky falls. The same story. Cross the ocean again, to the Andes, to the Amazon, to the civilizations of pre-Columbian South America. The Inca spoke of Tehuantinsuyu, the four quarters, the four directions of the world, all of which met at Cusco, the navel of the earth. And from Cusco, a cosmic rope, Capacñan, stretched upward to the sky. The SEC system, the network of sacred lines radiating from Cusco, was not just a calendar, not just a ritual map. It was an attempt to recreate the cosmic structure, the web of connections that once linked Earth to the stars, the same pattern, the same memory. In the Amazon basin, the indigenous tribes speak of the Axis Mundi as a great tree, the ceiba, the kapok tree, whose roots reach into the underworld and whose branches hold up the sky. Shamans climb the tree in trance, traveling between worlds, reenacting the ancient journey from earth to heaven. And in Mesoamerica, the Maya built their pyramids as sacred mountains, representations of wits. The world mountain, the place where the sky and earth meet. At the top of every pyramid was a temple, a doorway, a threshold between worlds. The same structure, the same function, the same memory. A ladder, a pillar, a tree, a mountain, something that connected Earth to the sky. But here is where the physics becomes unavoidable, because plasma discharge between celestial bodies is not theoretical. It is observable. It happens in our solar system right now. Jupiter and its moon Io are connected by a flux tube, a column of plasma that channels electrical current between the two bodies. NASA has photographed it. The Galileo spacecraft measured it. It is real. The discharge creates a glowing, visible column, an aurora-like structure that would be clearly visible from the surface of either body if you were standing there. Now scale this up. If Earth was once in close orbit around Saturn, close enough to be tidally locked, close enough to orbit within Saturn's magnetosphere, then the electromagnetic interaction between the two bodies would have been immense. Saturn has the second strongest magnetic field in the solar system. Earth has a magnetic field. When two magnetic fields interact at close range, they do not remain separate, they connect. Plasma flows along the magnetic field lines, creating a visible structure. It would look like a column, a pillar, a ladder of light. It would stretch from the surface of Earth, perhaps anchored at the magnetic pole, perhaps at the equator depending on the orbital configuration, up to Saturn, hanging massive and unmoving in the sky above. It would glow, violet, blue, red, the colors of ionized gas, the colors of an aurora, but fixed, stable, always there. It would be so large that it would fill a significant portion of the sky. Not a thin thread, but a vast column, kilometers wide, twisting slowly as plasma flowed along the magnetic field lines. And it would make a sound. Plasma discharges generate electromagnetic waves that, when they interact with Earth's atmosphere, create audible sound, crackling, humming, roaring. The ancients would have heard the pillar. They would have heard the voice of the sky. If you stood beneath it, you would feel small. You would feel connected to something unimaginably vast. You would think you were standing at the center of creation. And you would be right, because this structure, this electromagnetic pillar, would have been the defining feature of the sky. Not the moon, not the stars, this, the ladder to heaven. And then one day it broke, not slowly, not gradually, but suddenly, catastrophically, in the moment when Earth's orbit destabilized, when the gravitational configuration collapsed, when Earth was torn away from Saturn and flung into the outer solar system. The magnetospheres separated, the plasma column collapsed, the flux tube snapped, and the ladder was gone. Imagine what that would look like from the ground. Imagine watching the pillar, the structure that had been there for your entire life, for your parents' entire lives, for every generation, back to the beginning of memory, suddenly flicker, twist, and vanish. The sky would go dark. The connection would be severed. The fixed sun would begin to move for the first time, and you would know, with a certainty deeper than words, that the world had ended, that heaven and earth had been separated, that you were alone. This is what the myths remember, not the symbol of connection, but the fact of connection, not the metaphor of separation, but the event of separation. The Tower of Babel was never finished because the ladder it was trying to rebuild no longer had anything to connect to. Jacob's ladder was a memory of something his ancestors saw, a structure in the sky that no longer exists. The Jed pillar fell because the electromagnetic connection between Earth and Saturn collapsed when the planets separated. The myths are not primitive, they are precise. They are describing what they saw, and what they saw was a column of plasma connecting two worlds, a ladder reaching from Earth to a brown dwarf sun that no longer moves, that no longer glows, that has become a distant, ringed planet, beautiful and cold and dead. The ladder is gone, but the memory remains, carved into stone, whispered in myth, built into the architecture of every ancient civilization that tried desperately to reach back towards something that was lost, not as a symbol, as a map of the first sky. Chapter 4. The Catastrophists. There are men whose names you will not find in textbooks, men who spent their lives mapping a different history, a different cosmos, a different past. Men who died without recognition, without tenure, without the comfort of knowing their work would survive them. Their books gather dust in used bookstores. Their theories are footnotes in the margins of mainstream science. Their names are whispered with embarrassment in academic halls, as if speaking them aloud might contaminate the listener. But the stones remember what they said, and if you are willing to follow their work into the dark places where institutional science refuses to go, you will find something uncomfortable. They were not wrong, they were dangerous, because what they discovered was not a better theory. It was a memory that civilization has spent 10,000 years trying to forget. Let me introduce you to the catastrophists, the exiles, the men who saw what others refused to see. We begin with Immanuel Velikovsky, a name that still causes physicists to flinch. Born in 1895 in the Russian Empire, trained as a physician and psychoanalyst, Velikovsky was not supposed to become a heretic. He was not supposed to write the book that would make him the most controversial intellectual of the 20th century. But in 1950, he published Worlds in Collision, and the academic world tried to destroy him. The thesis was simple, and it was unforgivable. The solar system is not stable. It has not always been as it is now. Within human memory, within the span of recorded history, planets have moved. Orbits have changed. The sky itself has been rewritten. Velikovsky argued that Venus is a young planet, that it was ejected from Jupiter in the 15th century BCE, that it careened through the inner solar system, causing catastrophes on Earth, plagues, earthquakes, the parting of the Red Sea, the long day of Joshua when the sun stood still. Mainstream science called him a madman. Carl Sagan devoted an entire book to debunking him. Universities threatened to boycott the publisher, Macmillan, until they dropped Velikovsky from their catalog. But here is what no one talks about. Velikovsky made predictions, specific, testable predictions based on his catastrophic model, and many of them turned out to be correct. He predicted that Venus would be extremely hot, far hotter than conventional models suggested. In 1962, Mariner 2 confirmed Venus's surface temperature at 462 degrees Celsius. He predicted that Venus would have a dense, carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere. Confirmed. He predicted that Jupiter would emit radio waves. Confirmed in 1955, before the first spacecraft reached Jupiter. He was wrong about the details, wrong about the mechanisms, wrong about Venus being ejected in historical times. But he was right about the core insight. The solar system has not always been stable. Catastrophic planetary encounters have shaped human history, and buried in worlds in collision, almost as an aside, Velikovsky mentions Saturn. He mentions the ancient traditions that describe Saturn as a sun. He mentions the Golden Age. He mentions the fall. He did not develop the theory fully. That work would be left to others. But he opened the door. David Talbot walked through that door. In the 1970s, Talbot, a comparative mythologist, not a physicist, not an astronomer, but a man who read myths the way archaeologists read strata, began to notice patterns that no one else seemed to see. He read the Babylonian texts, the Egyptian texts, the Greek myths, the Norse sagas, the Vedic hymns, and he saw the same images repeated: a stationary sun, a cosmic column, a golden age under the rule of Saturn. In 1980, Talbot published The Saturn Myth, and the thesis was even more radical than Velikovsky's. Not Venus, Saturn. Saturn was once Earth's primary luminary. Earth orbited Saturn in a sub-brown dwarf system before being captured by the current sun. The Golden Age, the first time, the age of Kronos. These were not metaphors. They were memories of a different cosmic configuration. The book was ignored by mainstream academia, but it found an audience. A small, passionate group of researchers who saw what Talbot saw, that the myths were not primitive superstition, but sophisticated descriptions of plasma phenomena, of planetary configurations, of events that actually happened. Talbot co-founded the Thunderbolts Project, a research group dedicated to exploring the role of electricity and plasma in shaping planets, stars, and cosmic history. They were dismissed as pseudoscientists, as cranks, but their work continued, sir, quietly, persistently, building a model of the solar system that did not require slow, gradualist evolution, but allowed for catastrophic change. A model in which Earth once orbited Saturn. A model in which the myths are maps. Alongside Talbot was Wal Thornhill, an Australian physicist with a background in plasma science and electrical engineering. Thornhill did what Talbot could not. He provided the physics. He built the mathematical models. He explained how a Saturn-Earth system could have existed, how it could have been stable, how it could have ended. Plasma cosmology, the study of how electromagnetic forces shape the cosmos, was already a fringe discipline, dismissed by a physics establishment that had committed itself entirely to gravity-driven models. But Thornhill pushed further. He argued that planets are not electromagnetically neutral, that they carry charge, that when planets come into close proximity, They do not interact only through gravity. They interact through electrical discharge, through plasma phenomena that can reshape surfaces, shift orbits, ignite atmospheres. He explained the scars on Mars, the massive canyons, the inexplicable channels, not as products of water, erosion, but as electrical scarring from plasma discharge when Mars was in close proximity to another body. He explained the rings of Saturn, not as debris from a shattered moon, but as the remnant of materials stripped away during Saturn's transition from a brown dwarf to a captured planet. He explained the column of light described in every ancient myth not as religious symbolism, but as a plasma flux tube, a documented observable phenomenon that occurs when two magnetized bodies interact at close range. Thornhill gave the catastrophists what they needed most: scientific legitimacy. Not in the eyes of the establishment, they would never have that, but in the eyes of anyone willing to look at the evidence without prejudice. He made the impossible plausible. And then there was Eduardo Cardona. If Talbot opened the door and Thornhill provided the physics, Cardona spent his life walking through the ruins, cataloging every myth, every text, every carved stone that pointed toward the same conclusion. Cardona was born in Malta, trained in comparative mythology and ancient languages. He spent decades, literally decades, compiling evidence for the Saturn configuration. His magnum opus, God's Star, published in multiple volumes between 2006 and 2012, is over 1,300 pages of meticulously researched mythology, archaeology, and historical astronomy. He traced the worship of Saturn across every ancient civilization. He showed how the planet's name, Kronos, Shani, El, Ninurtas, carried the same connotations everywhere: the old god, the first king, the lord of the golden age, the devourer of his children. He cataloged the polar configuration described in ancient texts, a system in which Saturn, Mars, Venus, and Earth were aligned along a single axis, visible as a massive celestial structure from the surface of Earth. He explained why ancient peoples were obsessed with the number 7, 7 planets, 7 days, 7 gates, not because of astrology, but because in the Saturn system there were 7 visible celestial bodies in close proximity: Saturn, the Sun, distant, Mars, Venus, Mercury, and later Jupiter and the Moon. He explained the ubiquitous image of the eye in the sky, the eye of Ra, the eye of Horus, the all-seeing eye, not as a symbol of divine omniscience, but as a description of what Saturn looked like from Earth: a massive sphere with a dark polar vortex at its center, staring down like an unblinking eye. Cardona died in 2013. His books are out of print. His theories are ignored by mainstream archaeology. But if you read his work, if you sit with the 1,500 pages of evidence, the thousands of citations, the careful reconstruction of what the sky looked like before the catastrophe, you cannot dismiss it. Not because it is perfect, but because it is coherent, because it explains too much, because it makes the myths make sense. These men, Velikovsky, Talbot, Thornhill, Cardona, were not fools. They were not charlatans. They were serious scholars, trained in their disciplines, working from evidence. But they made a mistake, a fatal mistake. They told a story that institutional science could not tolerate, not because the story was wrong, but because if the story was right, then everything else was wrong. The gradualist model of planetary formation, the assumption of cosmic stability, the belief that the sky has always looked the way it looks now. If they were right, then human history is not what we think it is. Then civilization is not a slow climb from ignorance to knowledge, but a traumatized recovery from catastrophe. Then the ancients were not primitives staring at the stars in awe. They were survivors, trying to remember what happened. And that is a dangerous idea, because if it happened once, it can happen again. If the sky changed 10,000 years ago, it could change tomorrow. If the solar system is not stable, then neither are we. So these men were exiled. Their books were not reviewed in major journals. Their theories were not taught in universities. Their names became synonyms for pseudoscience. But the stones do not care about tenure. The myths do not care about peer review. And the evidence they compiled does not disappear just because we refuse to look at it. These men died without recognition. Velikovsky in 1979, Cardona in 2013, Talbot and Thornhill are still alive, still working, still building the model in obscurity. Their books gather dust. But the question they raised does not go away. What if the solar system is not stable? What if the sky we see is not the first sky? What if every ancient civilization is trying to tell us the same thing? That we are not living in the world we think we are living in, that we are living in the aftermath, in the ruins of something that was destroyed, not as myth, as memory, and the catastrophists, the exiles, the heretics, the men whose names you will not find in textbooks, they were the cartographers of that memory. They were the ones willing to say what no one else would say. The sky has changed before, and it can change again. Chapter 5: The Brown Dwarf Hypothesis. Let us talk about what Saturn is, not what we have been taught it is, but what it actually is. Saturn is the sixth planet from the Sun. It orbits at an average distance of 1.4 billion kilometers. It is the second largest planet in the solar system, with a mass 95 times that of Earth. It is composed primarily of hydrogen and helium, the same elements that make up stars. It has a system of rings, 146 known moons, and a hexagonal storm at its north pole that has been raging for decades. And it is warm. Not warm like a planet should be warm, heated by distant sunlight, storing energy in its atmosphere and releasing it slowly, but warm like something that is still burning, still dying, still cooling from a heat that should not be there. Saturn emits 2.5 times more energy than it receives from the Sun. Read that again. Saturn radiates more heat into space than it absorbs from the Sun. It is not in thermal equilibrium. It is not a passive object reflecting light. It is an active heat source. This is not a secret. This is NASA data. This is thermodynamic measurement. Every introductory astronomy textbook mentions it and then moves on as if it is not remarkable. But it is remarkable because there is no mechanism in conventional planetary science to explain why Saturn should still be warm. If Saturn formed 4.6 billion years ago from the same primordial disk as the rest of the solar system, then it should have cooled by now. It should be in thermal equilibrium with its environment, absorbing exactly as much energy as it emits. But it is not. It is still glowing, still radiating, still cooling from something. And the question that no one asks is, what was it cooling from? Let me introduce you to brown dwarfs. Brown dwarfs are objects that exist in the strange territory between planets and stars. They are too massive to be called planets, more than 13 times the mass of Jupiter, but too small to sustain the hydrogen fusion that powers true stars. They are failed stars, stars that never ignited, objects that formed from collapsing gas clouds, that gathered mass and gravity, that heated under compression, but could not achieve the critical temperature and pressure needed to begin fusing hydrogen into helium. But they do burn, for a time. Brown dwarfs can sustain deuterium fusion, the fusion of heavy hydrogen, for a brief period after their formation. Millions of years, perhaps tens of millions. During this time, they emit light and heat, not the brilliant white light of a true star, but a dim, smoldering glow in the infrared and violet spectrum. They glow red. They glow purple. They emit a soft, diffuse light that does not illuminate like the sun, but fills the sky with a perpetual twilight. And then, as the deuterium is exhausted, they fade, they cool, they become dark, cold objects, too dim to see with the naked eye, radiating only, faintly in infrared, slowly losing the heat they accumulated during their brief burning. But that cooling process takes billions of years, and during that cooling, they emit more energy than they receive from external sources. They remain warm. Saturn has a mass of 95 Jupiter masses. It is below the threshold for deuterium fusion, which requires at least 13 Jupiter masses. So Saturn is not a brown dwarf. Not technically. Not now. But it is very close. Saturn is what astronomers call a sub-brown dwarf, an object that is almost massive enough to have been a brown dwarf that shares many characteristics with brown dwarfs, but did not quite reach the critical mass needed to ignite. Except mass is not the only factor. Composition matters. Density matters. Initial conditions matter. If Saturn formed in a different environment, if it accumulated material in a denser region of the primordial disk, if it captured additional mass early in its history, if it underwent a period of rapid accretion, then it is possible that Saturn did briefly sustain deuterium fusion for a few million years, perhaps 10 million, perhaps longer, long enough to glow, long enough to emit light, long enough to be a sun. And then the fuel ran out, the fusion stopped, and Saturn began the long, slow process of cooling, a process that 4.6 billion years later is still ongoing. This is not speculation. This is extrapolation from known physics. Brown dwarfs exist. Sub-brown dwarfs exist. Objects that briefly ignite and then fade exist throughout the galaxy. Saturn is one of them. And the question is not whether Saturn could have been a brown dwarf. The question is, what would it have looked like if it was? Imagine a brown dwarf star with 95 times the mass of Jupiter, not large enough to fuse hydrogen, but large enough to sustain deuterium fusion for a few million years. It glows with an internal heat, emitting primarily in the infrared and violet spectrum. The light is not bright, not like the sun. If you stood on a planet orbiting this brown dwarf, you would not feel the searing heat of noon, the blinding light of a yellow star. You would feel warmth, gentle, diffuse, constant warmth. And you would see light, soft purple light, filling the entire sky, casting no shadows because it comes from everywhere at once. The brown dwarf is large. From a close orbit, it would appear 10, 20, perhaps 50 times larger than the sun appears from Earth. It would dominate the sky, a massive purple sphere hanging motionless if the planet is tidally locked, never rising, never setting, always there. And because the light is dim, the planet would not be scorched. It would not be a hellscape like Mercury or Venus under the current sun, it would be mild, temperate. The energy output of a brown dwarf is low enough that a planet in close orbit, perhaps a few million kilometers, a fraction of the distance from Earth to the Sun, would receive just enough energy to maintain liquid water, to sustain an atmosphere to support life. But the planet would be tidally locked, one face always toward the star, one face always in darkness, except it would not be darkness, not complete darkness, because brown dwarfs emit in all directions and an atmosphere scatters light. The night side of the planet would glow with a faint, perpetual twilight, dim but not dark, enough to see by, enough to live by. The entire planet would exist in a state of eternal twilight. No day, no night, no dawn or dusk, just the endless soft glow of a brown dwarf sun that does not move. And there would be no seasons, because a tidally locked planet has no axial tilt. The star is always in the same position. The climate is stable, unchanging, locked into a permanent equilibrium. This is not paradise, but it is stability. A world without extremes, without storms, without ice ages or droughts. A world where life could evolve in a stable environment, where civilizations could arise without the pressure of seasonal migration, without the chaos of unpredictable climate. A golden age. Now let us add the other planets. Because if Saturn was a brown dwarf sun, it would not have been alone. Brown dwarfs can have planets. They can capture objects. They can form small, stable systems. And the myths describe not just Saturn, but a configuration, a system. Mars and Venus visible in the sky. Earth locked in orbit, a family of worlds circling a dying star. The physics allows this. Gravitationally, a brown dwarf with 95 Jupiter masses can easily hold several Earth-sized planets in stable, tidally locked orbits. The orbits would be close, millions of kilometers, not billions, but they would be stable. Mars, with its thin atmosphere and cold surface, might have been farther out, colder, but still visible in the sky as a red disk. Venus, closer in, might have been warmer, brighter, glowing with reflected light from Saturn, and from Earth's surface you would see them, not as distant points of light like the planets appear now, but as disks, as worlds, close enough to see features, to see atmosphere, to see structure. The sky would not be empty, it would be full. Saturn, massive and purple hanging overhead, Mars, a red companion, smaller but distinct, Venus, bright and pale, and perhaps they would align. In certain configurations, they would form a column, a vertical stack, Saturn at the top, Venus and Mars in the middle, Earth at the bottom, a ladder of worlds. This is the polar configuration, described by Cardona, by Talbot, by the myths themselves. Not planets scattered across the sky, but planets aligned, a cosmic column, a structure visible from Earth's surface. And if Saturn and Earth were connected by a plasma flux tube, that column would glow. It would be a pillar of light, stretching from the ground to the sky, connecting Earth to its sun. The myths describe this, all of them. The ladder, the pillar, the tree, the mountain. They describe what the sky looked like. But this system was not built to last. Brown dwarfs are transitional objects. They burn for a time, and then they fade. And as they fade, they lose mass, blown away by stellar wind, by radiation pressure, by the slow erosion of their outer layers. As a brown dwarf loses mass, its gravitational influence weakens. The planets in orbit around it feel less pull. Their orbits begin to drift. And if the system is close to another star, if the brown dwarf and its planets are moving through a region of space where larger stars exist, then capture becomes possible. The Sun, a stable G type main sequence star, exerts gravity. If the Saturn system passed close enough to the Sun, the planets could be pulled away, not all at once, but one by one over thousands of years, the orbits would destabilize. Earth, being the most massive of the inner planets, might have been the first to be captured, or the last. The timing is uncertain, but the result is clear. Earth was torn from the Saturn system and pulled into orbit around the Sun, and everything changed. The light changed, from purple to yellow, from dim to bright. The Sun began to move. Because Earth was no longer tidally locked, it began to rotate. Day and night appeared for the first time. The climate changed. Seasons appeared because Earth's orbit around the Sun is elliptical, and because Earth has an axial tilt, a tilt that may have been established during the violent capture process. The sky changed. Saturn, once a massive disk overhead, became a distant point of light. Mars and Venus, once companions, became wandering stars, and the latter broke. The plasma connection severed. The column of light that had connected Earth to Saturn for millions of years vanished in an instant. Imagine witnessing that. Imagine watching the sun you have always known, the purple sun that has hung motionless in the sky for your entire life, suddenly dim, shrink, and begin to move away. Imagine watching the column of light flicker and collapse. Imagine feeling the ground shake as gravitational stresses shift the crust, as tides surge, as the planet itself adjusts to a new orbit. And then imagine waking up the next day and seeing a sun you have never seen before, brighter, hotter, moving. That is what the myths remember, not metaphor, physics, not allegory, astronomy. The day the first sun died and the second sun rose. This is the brown dwarf hypothesis. This is the Saturn configuration, and it is not impossible. It requires only that Saturn was, briefly, a brown dwarf. That Earth orbited Saturn before orbiting the Sun. That the capture happened within the last 10,000 to 15,000 years. The physics allows it. The mythology describes it. The evidence, geological, archaeological, mythological, points toward it. And the silence from mainstream science is not because the hypothesis is absurd. It is because the hypothesis is testable. And if it is tested, and if it is correct, then everything we think we know about the stability of the solar system, about the history of Earth, about the origins of civilization, all of it will have to be rewritten. That is why the catastrophists were exiled, not because they were wrong, but because they were dangerous. Chapter 6: The Golden Age. Every culture on Earth remembers paradise, and every culture mourns its loss, not as a spiritual metaphor, not as a philosophical ideal, but as a place, a time, a world that existed and then ended. The Greeks called it the Age of Kronos, the rule of Saturn, when men lived like gods, free from toil, free from war, free from death itself. Hesiod writes in Works and Days that during this time the earth bore fruit of its own accord, abundant and ungrudging, and in contentment they lived upon their lands with many good things. The Hindus called it Satya Yuga, the age of truth, the first and longest of the cosmic ages, when Dharma walked on four legs, when gods and humans lived together, where there was no disease, no hunger, no suffering. The Chinese called it the age of perfect virtue, when the emperor did not need to govern because the world governed itself, when the people lived in harmony with the Tao, when heaven and earth were in balance. The Hebrews called it Eden, the garden before the fall, the place where Adam walked with God in the cool of the day, where the tree of life grew, where death did not exist. The Norse called it the time before Ragnarok, when Asgard stood intact, when Yggdrasil was strong, when the gods feasted in Valhalla, and the world below was green and peaceful. The Maya, the Inca, the Hopi, the Aboriginal Australians, every culture, every tradition, every civilization has the same story. There was a golden age, and it ended, not gradually, not through slow decay, but suddenly, catastrophically, in a moment of fire and flood and darkness. And we have been taught to dismiss this. We have been taught that these are wishful fantasies, that primitive peoples simply imagined a perfect past to contrast with their difficult present, that the Golden Age is a psychological projection, not a historical reality. But what if it was real? What if there was a time when the climate was stable, when the seasons did not exist, when the world was mild and unchanging? What if the Golden Age was not a dream, but a climate system? And what if that system was dying from the moment it began? Let us return to the physics, because the physics explains the paradise. A tidally locked planet orbiting a brown dwarf sun experiences no axial tilt. The star is always in the same position in the sky. There is no variation in the angle of incoming light. There are no seasons. On Earth today, we have winter and summer because our planet tilts 23.5 degrees relative to our orbital plane. When the northern hemisphere tilts toward the sun, it is summer in the north and winter in the south. 6 months later, the tilt reverses and the seasons reverse. But a tidally locked planet does not tilt. It does not rotate relative to its star. One hemisphere always faces the star. One hemisphere always faces away. This creates a permanent climate gradient. The side facing the star is warm. The side facing away is cold. But the temperature difference is not extreme, not like the difference between Earth's equator and poles, because the star is dim and because atmospheric circulation redistributes heat. The result is a band of temperate climate around the terminator, the boundary between the light side and the dark side, a zone where the temperature is mild, where liquid water exists, where life can flourish. And because the star does not move, this climate is stable. There are no storms driven by seasonal temperature changes, no hurricanes, no monsoons, no droughts followed by floods. The wind patterns are constant. The rainfall is predictable. The temperature varies only slightly from year to year. This is not speculation. This is climate modeling. Astronomers have run simulations of tidally locked exoplanets, planets orbiting red dwarfs, planets orbiting brown dwarfs, and the results are consistent. Those worlds can have stable, habitable climates in the terminator zone. Mild, temperate, unchanging. A world where agriculture would be effortless, where crops would grow year-round, where there would be no need to migrate with the seasons, no need to store food for winter, no need to build shelters against storms. A world where early humans could thrive without the constant pressure of survival. This is the Golden Age, not a myth, a climate model. But there is more. Because a brown dwarf sun emits primarily in the infrared and violet spectrum, the light quality on such a world would be different from what we experience under our current sun. Human eyes evolved to see in the visible spectrum the range of wavelengths from red to violet that our current sun emits most strongly. We see best in the yellow-green range, which corresponds to the peak output of a G-type star like the Sun, but under a brown dwarf emitting in violet and infrared, the visual environment would shift. The sky would not be blue. Blue skies are caused by Rayleigh scattering. Shorter wavelengths of light, blue and violet, scatter more in the atmosphere than longer wavelengths, red and yellow. Under our current sun, which emits strongly in the blue-yellow range, the sky appears blue because the blue light scatters everywhere. But under a brown dwarf emitting primarily in violet, the scattering would be different. The sky would glow purple, deep purple, the color of twilight, the color of the hour before dawn, and the light would be soft, not harsh like midday sun, but gentle, diffuse, filling the entire sky rather than coming from a single point. There would be no shadows, or rather, the shadows would be faint, indistinct, because the light comes from a large, diffuse source rather than a small, bright one. The Hopi describe exactly this. They say the first world had purple light and no shadows, not as poetry, as observation. And there is something else, something deeply strange. If humans evolved under a brown dwarf sun, if early hominids spent millions of years in a world lit by violet and infrared light, then their vision would have adapted to that environment. Human eyes would be more sensitive to violet and infrared wavelengths. The proteins in our retinas, the structure of our cones and rods, would be optimized for the light that was actually present. And when the sky changed, when Earth was captured by the sun, and the light shifted from violet to yellow, human vision would have been wrong for the new environment. We would be seeing the world through eyes designed for a different sun. This might explain why humans have always been drawn to twilight, why dawn and dusk feel sacred, feel like the right time of day, why the violet hour, the brief moment when the sky is purple, feels like home, not because it is beautiful, but because it is a memory, a genetic memory of the light we evolved under. And there is the question of gravity. If Earth was in a close orbit around Saturn, close enough to be tidally locked, close enough to orbit in a few days or weeks rather than a year, then the gravitational environment would have been different, not massively different. Saturn's gravity at the distance of a stable orbit would not create crushing pressure or weightlessness, but there would be tidal effects, subtle variations in gravitational pull depending on the position in orbit, and human physiology might have adapted to those conditions. This is wild speculation, but consider, ancient texts describe the people of the Golden Age as larger, stronger, longer lived than people today. The Nephilim of Genesis, the Titans of Greek myth, the giants who built the megaliths. What if this is not exaggeration? What if the gravitational environment of the Saturn system allowed for slightly different bone density, slightly different muscle development, slightly different aging processes? What if the people who lived under the first sun were, in measurable ways, different from us? And when the sky changed, when Earth moved to a new orbit, with a different gravitational environment, that difference would have collapsed. The giants would have weakened. The long-lived would have begun to age. The Golden Age would have ended not just as a climate shift, but as a biological transition, a fall, not from grace, from equilibrium. But the most important aspect of the Golden Age is not the climate, not the light, not even the biology. It is the stability, because in a tidally locked system orbiting a brown dwarf, nothing changes. The sun does not move, the temperature does not vary, the seasons do not cycle. Time itself is different, measured not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the slow, almost imperceptible cooling of the star. Generations could pass without any noticeable change in the sky. Centuries, millennia. You would grow up, live your entire life, and die under the same purple sun that your great 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 grandparents saw. The world would feel eternal, unchanging, as if it had always been this way and would always be this way. There would be no sense of progress, no sense of history, no concept of before and after, because nothing would mark the passage of time except the lives and deaths of individuals. This is what the myths describe when they speak of the Golden Age, not just peace and plenty, but timelessness. The feeling that the world is not moving toward anything, not decaying, not building, just being. Hesiod says that during the age of Kronos, men lived like gods, without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief. And they did not die, they fell asleep. The Hindus say that Satya Yuga lasted 1,128,000 years, not because they were counting, but because the age felt endless, because the world did not change. This is not a myth about happiness. It is a myth about stasis, and stasis in evolutionary terms is death, because a species that does not face pressure does not evolve. A civilization that does not face challenge does not innovate. A world that does not change does not grow. The Golden Age was stable, but stability is not the same as vitality. And beneath the surface, the system was dying. Because brown dwarfs do not last. They burn for a few million years, and then they fade. The deuterium runs out, the fusion stops, the light dims, and as the brown dwarf cools, it loses mass. The outer layers blow away. The gravitational pull weakens. The planets feel it. Their orbits begin to drift, slowly at first, imperceptibly. But over thousands of years, the drift accelerates. The system becomes unstable, and the people living on those planets, if they are advanced enough to measure, to calculate, to observe, would begin to notice. The sun is dimming. The orbits are changing. The stability is fracturing. The Golden Age is ending, not because of sin, not because of human arrogance or divine punishment, but because the star is dying, and there is nothing they can do to stop it. This is the tragedy at the heart of every Golden Age myth. Not that humanity was cast out of paradise, but that paradise itself was unsustainable, that the world they lived in, the stable, unchanging, eternal world, was only stable because it was locked in a temporary configuration. A brown dwarf sun holding together a family of planets. A system that could last for a few million years, long enough for life to evolve, for civilizations to rise, for myths to form, but not forever. And when the end came, it did not come gently. It came as catastrophe, as orbital collapse, as gravitational chaos. The planets were torn away. Earth was captured by a new star. The purple sun became a distant memory, And the people who survived, the ones who lived through the transition, who watched the sky change, who felt the ground shake, they told stories. They carved warnings into stone. They built monuments trying to remember, trying to hold on to the world that was lost. But memory fades, language shifts, civilizations fall, and within a few thousand years, the Golden Age became a myth. The purple sun became a metaphor. The ladder to heaven became a religious symbol. And we forgot, not because we wanted to forget, but because the trauma was too great, because the sky that replaced the old sky was so bright, so insistent, so present, that it erased the memory of what came before. But the memory is still there, in the myths, in the stones, in the deep, uneasy feeling you get when you look at the sky during the violet hour and think, just for a moment, this feels like home, not as myth, as memory. Chapter 7. The Day the Sky Changed. Tell me something. When you woke up this morning, did the sun surprise you? Of course not, because the sun is a constant. It rises, it sets, it has always risen, it has always set. This is the architecture of your certainty, the rhythm that tells you the world is stable, predictable, knowable. But what if I told you that 12,000 years ago, a human being woke up to a sun they had never seen before, not in a dream, not in a vision, but in the cold, physical reality of a sky that had changed color overnight? This is not speculation. This is reconstruction. Because if the Saturn theory is correct, if Earth truly orbited a brown dwarf star before being captured by our current sun, then there was a moment, a singular, catastrophic moment, when one sky ended and another began, not gradually, not peacefully, but in a violent unraveling that would have rewritten the heavens, the oceans, and the human soul itself. The question is not whether this happened. The question is how anyone survived to remember it. Let us begin with the physics, because what we are about to describe is not a myth. It is an orbital catastrophe. For thousands, and perhaps tens of thousands of years, Earth existed in what plasma physicists call a sub-brown dwarf configuration. Saturn, still radiating the dying heat of its protostellar phase, sat at the center. Earth, Mars, and Venus orbited in close proximity, tidally locked, bathed in perpetual violet twilight. The system was stable, not permanent, but stable, like a house built on a fault line, because brown dwarfs do not burn forever. They are failed stars, objects with insufficient mass to sustain hydrogen fusion. They glow, they radiate, but they are dying from the moment they form, and Saturn was no exception. As Saturn's internal heat dissipated, the delicate gravitational balance began to shift. The planets, once held in stable orbits by Saturn's residual mass and electromagnetic forces, began to drift. Not in years, but in centuries, a slow hemorrhaging of orbital coherence that would have been invisible to any observer on the ground, until it wasn't. The collapse, when it came, was not a single event. It was a cascade, a domino fall of gravitational perturbations that would have unfolded over weeks, perhaps months. Mars may have been ejected first, flung outward into a wider orbit. Venus, too close to Saturn, may have spiraled inward before being hurled away. And Earth, caught in the chaos, tumbling through the dark, its axial tilt destabilizing, its magnetic field convulsing, and then the sun. Not little star sun, not yet, but the sun as captor, as the new center of mass, as the gravitational well that would drag Earth into a new orbit, a new rhythm, a new sky. You can calculate this. Astrophysicists have. The energy required to shift a planet from one star system to another is immense, but not impossible. It happens. Rogue planets are captured, orbits are stolen. The universe is not gentle, and Earth was stolen. Imagine you are standing on the surface of Earth 12,000 years ago. For your entire life, the sky has been violet. The sun, Saturn, is a vast, dim sphere that fills a quarter of the sky, unmoving, eternal. There's no dawn, no dusk, no concept of day as we understand it. The light is soft, diffuse, like perpetual twilight. The stars are visible even in the brightest hours. The temperature is stable, the winds are gentle. This is the only sky you have ever known. And then one morning you wake up and the purple is gone. In its place, a point of light. Small, distant, but impossibly bright. It hurts to look at. The sky around it is no longer violet, but a pale, washed-out blue, a color you have no word for because it has never existed in your world. The light is harsh, cutting, revealing textures and shadows you have never seen. The temperature begins to climb, not in hours, but in minutes. Your skin, evolved under the gentle glow of infrared radiation, begins to burn. And then the horizon moves, because for the first time in human memory, the sun is not fixed. It is moving across the sky, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but moving, rising in the east, arcing overhead, descending in the west. A rotation you have never witnessed, a cycle you have no framework to comprehend. This is not poetry. This is the cognitive violence of a paradigm shift written into the sky itself. Every human on Earth, simultaneously, witnessing the fundamental architecture of reality change, not in metaphor, in light, in heat, in motion. The trauma would have been absolute, but the light was only the beginning. Because when a planet transitions from one stellar system to another, the gravitational stresses do not manifest only in the sky. They manifest in the crust, in the oceans, in the magnetic field that shields life from cosmic radiation. Earth's axial tilt, the 23.5-degree angle that gives us seasons, was not a feature of the Saturn system. A tidally locked planet has no tilt. It presents the same face to its star, always. But when Earth was wrenched into the sun's orbit, the gravitational torque would have been catastrophic. The planet would have tumbled. Not instantly, but over a period of months or years, the axis would have shifted, wobbled, and finally stabilized into the tilt we know today. This is not speculation. Planetary scientists call this obliquity shift, and it has been observed in exoplanet systems undergoing stellar capture, and the consequences for Earth would have been apocalyptic. The oceans, which had existed in stable equilibrium under Saturn's gentle pull, would have surged, not from rain, not from melting ice, but from gravitational displacement. As Earth's rotation changed, as the tidal forces of the new sun asserted themselves, the water would have moved. Entire coastlines submerged in hours, inland seas drained, tidal waves, kilometers high, racing across continents, carving valleys, depositing sediment layers that geologists today call the Younger Dryas boundary. This is the flood. Not one flood, but a planetary rearrangement of water itself. And if you were there, if you stood on a hillside and watched the ocean rise toward you, not as a wave, but as a horizon, slow and inexorable, you would understand why every culture on Earth remembers this moment, why they carved it into stone, why they encoded it in myth with a fervor reserved for survival instructions. Because it was not a story, it was a map, a warning, a memory so traumatic it became sacred. But there is one more element to this catastrophe that modern science has only recently begun to understand: the noise. When planets come into close proximity, when their magnetospheres intersect, when their atmospheres scrape against each other across the void, they do not do so silently. They discharge massive electrical arcs, visible across thousands of kilometers, crackling between worlds like titanic lightning bolts. Plasma physicists call these interplanetary discharges, and they produce sound. Not sound that travels through space. There is no medium for that. But sound that travels through the ionosphere, through the atmosphere, through the ground itself. Low frequency rumbles, high pitched shrieks, sounds that have no earthly equivalent because they are the sounds of worlds colliding. And humans would have heard them. The Bible calls them the sound of the trumpet. The Norse called them Gjallarhorn, the horn that signals Ragnarok. The Hopi speak of the purification fires announced by a great noise from the sky. Mesoamerican codices describe the voice of the gods that preceded the flood. Not metaphor, acoustic documentation. Because if you stood beneath a sky where Saturn and Jupiter and Mars were visible not as distant points of light, but as looming spheres, close enough to show surface detail, and if those spheres were arcing with electrical discharge bright enough to illuminate the ground, you would hear it. A sound so vast, so alien, so fundamentally wrong that it would rewrite your understanding of what the universe is capable of. And when it finally stopped, when the planets settled into their new orbits, when the discharges faded, when the oceans stilled and the new sun rose and set in its predictable rhythm, what would be left? Survivors, scattered across a drowned world, their cities gone, their fields submerged, their priests unable to explain what had happened because the language for orbital mechanics did not exist. The language for stellar capture did not exist. The language for axial tilt did not exist. All they had were the words for what they had seen: a sun that moved, a flood that drowned the world, a ladder to heaven that broke, a sky that changed color, a sound like the voice of God. And so they wrote it down. In every language they knew, on every surface they could carve, not as myth, but as testimony, as the only record of the day the first sky died. Because amnesia is not always a choice. Sometimes it is a survival mechanism. Sometimes the mind erases what it cannot process. And sometimes an entire species forgets its own past because remembering would mean acknowledging just how fragile the present truly is. But the stones do not forget. The sediment does not forget. The myths, carved into temple walls and whispered across generations, do not forget. They remember the day the sky changed. And if you listen carefully, if you sit with the old texts, with the flood myths, with the astronomical anomalies that make no sense under the current sky, you can hear it too. Not as history, as trauma, not as myth, as memory. Chapter 8: The Evidence in Stone. You can go there, not to a museum, not to a library. You can stand in the places where the old world died and feel the weight of what was lost beneath your feet, because the stones do not lie. They do not evolve their testimony. They do not adapt their witness to fit the acceptable narrative. If you know how to read them, if you are willing to see what they are saying, they will tell you the same story the myths tell, that the sky changed, that something ended, that we are living in the wreckage of a world we no longer remember. This is not speculation. This is geology. This is architecture. This is the cold, measurable weight of physical evidence that refuses to fit the timeline we have been given. And the question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is why we have spent so long pretending it doesn't. Let us begin with Stonehenge. You know the image, the massive sarsen stones arranged in a circle on the Salisbury Plain, ancient and silent under the English sky. Tourists visit, solstice ceremonies are held. The academic consensus is clear. It was a calendar, an astronomical observatory aligned to the summer solstice sunrise. But there is a problem. The alignments do not work, not perfectly, not the way they should if the monument was designed under the current sky. The solstice alignment is close, but not exact. And there are other stones, other markers within the complex that point to nothing. No star, no constellation, no celestial event that occurs under the sky we know. Archaeoastronomers have documented this for decades. They call them residual alignments, features that seem to track objects or events that no longer exist in the visible heavens. The assumption is always the same: ancient error, primitive observation, symbolic rather than literal. But what if it is not error? What if Stonehenge was built to track a sky that no longer exists? If you stand at the center of the circle now, if you place your hand on the cold surface of the heel stone, you will feel something the tourists do not feel: the silence of a monument built for an audience that is no longer watching. An observatory pointed at ghosts, not metaphorical ghosts, celestial ghosts. Consider Göbekli Tepe, 11,000 years old, older than agriculture, older than pottery, older than the supposed dawn of civilization itself. Massive T-shaped pillars carved with images of animals, foxes, vultures, serpents, scorpions, arranged in circular enclosures that were deliberately buried after construction. Deliberately buried, as if the builders knew they were sealing something that should not be remembered. The alignments at Göbekli Tepe point to the constellation Cygnus, but not as Cygnus appears now, as it would have appeared in 10,000 BCE, during the Younger Dryas, during the time when the old world was ending. The stone pillars track a sky that was already changing, a sky in the process of becoming this sky. And the carvings, if you study them closely, do not depict normal animals. They depict creatures in postures of terror: birds fleeing, serpents coiled in defensive positions, scorpions with raised stingers. Not decoration, documentation. A record carved by people who had seen the sky break and wanted to leave proof that it had happened. If you go there now, if you stand among the pillars in the cold Anatolian morning, you will feel the silence of a place that was built to remember something that was already being forgotten. The dust settles in the grooves of carvings that describe a trauma we have no language for, not as a temple, as a grave marker for the first sky. And then there is the precession problem. Precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars to shift over a 26,000-year cycle, is one of the most sophisticated astronomical phenomena ancient cultures tracked. The Egyptians knew it. The Mayans knew it. The Vedic astronomers of India encoded it into their cosmology. But here is what does not make sense. You cannot observe precession in a single human lifetime. You cannot observe it in 10 lifetimes. It takes centuries, millennia, of continuous, meticulous record keeping to detect the shift. And yet, cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years all tracked it with obsessive precision. Why? Why would a pre industrial society invest generations of labor into tracking a cycle they would never live to see complete? Why build temples aligned to positions the stars occupied centuries before the builders were born? Why encode mathematical ratios into pyramid dimensions that describe celestial mechanics no farmer or priest should need to understand, unless they were not tracking it from the beginning, unless they inherited the knowledge from a civilization that had already seen the sky change, a civilization that knew, because they had lived through it, that the heavens were not fixed, that the stars could move, that the sky itself could be rewritten overnight. The precession obsession is not about astronomy. It is about trauma. It is the behavior of a species that watched the cosmos betray them once and has spent the last 10,000 years making sure they will see it coming if it happens again. Every alignment, every observatory, every star map carved into stone is not curiosity. It is vigilance. It is the testimony of survivors who learned that the sky is not eternal. 10,000 years ago, something happened, not gradually, not over centuries, rapidly, violently. In the span of a single human generation, the world changed. Advanced settlements were abandoned. Göbekli Tepe was buried. The megafauna, mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, went extinct across multiple continents, almost simultaneously. Human populations collapsed. Genetic studies show a bottleneck, a moment when our species nearly died out. This is the Younger Dryas boundary. 12,800 years ago, the climate lurched into chaos. Temperatures plummeted since ice returned. And then, just as suddenly, it ended. The ice melted, the seas rose, and when the survivors emerged, they built the first cities, invented agriculture, and began to write. But they did not write about what came before. They wrote myths, flood stories, tales of gods who fell from the sky, legends of a golden age that ended in fire and water. Mainstream archaeology attributes the Younger Dryas to a comet impact, a hypothesis that was ridiculed for decades before evidence finally forced its acceptance. But even that does not explain everything. It does not explain why the abandonment was so total, why sites like Göbekli Tepe, which show no signs of warfare or disease, were simply walked away from, why the survivors seem to start over as if the knowledge of the previous world was too dangerous to carry forward. Unless the catastrophe was not just geological, unless it was cosmological, unless the survivors knew that the sky itself had turned against them and that the only way to endure was to forget. Let us talk about the petroglyphs. Across the American Southwest, across Australia, across Scandinavia, and South Africa, there are images carved into stone that do not depict anything in nature. Not animals, not people, not landscapes, spirals, concentric circles, plasma formations, shapes that look like electrical discharges frozen in stone. Anthony Parrott, a plasma physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, spent years cataloging these images. He compared them to the shapes produced in laboratory plasma experiments, high energy electrical discharges between charged bodies. The match was exact, not similar, exact. The petroglyphs depict what the sky would look like during a planetary scale plasma event, the kind of event that would occur if Earth passed through the electromagnetic field of another celestial body. If Saturn and Earth were once in close proximity, if they were connected by a visible plasma column, and if that connection was severed violently, the sky would have erupted in shapes our ancestors had no words for, so they carved them, not as art, as testimony. If you visit these sites now, if you place your hand on the rock face and trace the spirals with your fingers, you will feel the texture of a memory that predates language. The stone is warm in the sun, but the grooves are cold. Cold with the weight of something witnessed that could not be explained, not myth, evidence. And then there are the maps, the Piri Race map, the Orontius Phineas map, cartographic anomalies that depict coastlines as they existed thousands of years before they were supposedly discovered. Antarctica without ice, river deltas in the Sahara. The standard explanation is that these are copies of older maps, now lost. Maps made by a civilization we have no record of. A civilization that mapped the world during an age when the geography itself was different. But there is another anomaly. The maps are accurate, but the stellar coordinates are wrong. They are drawn as if the cartographers were navigating by stars that were in different positions, not by a little, by enough to suggest that the maps were made under a sky with a different axial tilt. A sky from before Earth's current 23.5 degree obliquity was established. Before the capture, before the day the sun moved and the seasons began and the old world drowned. If you study these maps now, if you overlay them with modern satellite data, you will see the ghost of a coastline that should not exist in recorded history. The silt of rivers that have been dry for 10,000 years. The outline of ice sheets that melted in a geological instant, not fantasy, cartography. The testimony of people who saw the world before the sky changed and drew what they saw so that we might one day understand what was lost. There is a place in eastern Washington called the Channeled Scablands. If you fly over it, you will see something impossible, massive channels carved into bedrock, gouged as if by the hand of something vast and violent. Geologists resisted the evidence for decades. They said the landscape was formed gradually, over millions of years, by normal erosion. But the math did not work. The channels were too deep, too wide, too sudden. J. Harlan Bretz, the geologist who proposed the truth, was ridiculed. He said the landscape was carved by a catastrophic flood, not over millennia, but in days. A wall of water hundreds of feet high, moving at the speed of a freight train, carrying boulders the size of houses, scouring the bedrock down to bare stone. It took 50 years for the evidence to force acceptance. The flood happened, not gradually, catastrophically, and it was not alone. Across the planet, there are scars like this. The Carolina Bays, 500,000 elliptical depressions across the eastern United States, all aligned in the same direction, as if something struck the continent from the northwest. The Burkle Crater in the Indian Ocean, the Australian megafauna extinction layer, not isolated events, a global catastrophe, and the timing everywhere, the same timing. 10 to 12,000 years ago, the Younger Dryas boundary, The end of the Ice Age, the moment the myths say the sky changed and the floods came and the Golden Age ended. If you stand in the channeled scablands now, if you run your hand along the polished bedrock, you will feel the cold weight of water that should not have been there. The silence of a landscape that remembers what happened even if we do not. Not erosion, a displacement. The gravitational trauma of a world pulled into a new orbit. You see, the evidence is not hidden. It is not locked in vaults or guarded by conspiracies. It is there, in the stones, in the alignments, in the maps, and the carvings, and the scars in the earth itself. The problem is not that we lack evidence. The problem is that the evidence describes something we are not allowed to believe. It describes a sky that changed, a sun that died, a world that ended and was rebuilt by survivors who had no framework to explain what they had seen, so they called it myth, called it gods, called it the will of heaven. But the stones do not call it myth. The stones call it memory. And if you are willing to listen, if you are willing to stand in the silence of these places and feel the cold weight of what they are saying, you will understand that we are not the first civilization to look at the sky and believe it was eternal. We are just the first to forget that it wasn't. Chapter 9, The Forbidden Memory. There is a reason you do not know this story, not because the evidence is weak, not because the scholars failed to notice, but because forgetting, true structural forgetting, is a function that civilizations perform on themselves when the truth is too destabilizing to carry forward. This is not conspiracy. This is survival. Because if you remember that the sky can change, that the sun itself can die, that the world you trust is only one configuration among infinite possible catastrophes, then you cannot build cities. You cannot plant crops for a harvest you may never see. You cannot raise children in a world you know is temporary. So you forget, not all at once, not deliberately, but in layers across generations, until the memory becomes myth, and the myth becomes metaphor, and the metaphor becomes nothing at all. And what remains is not history. It is a scar that has healed over so completely we no longer remember the wound. Let us talk about trauma, not personal trauma, collective trauma, the kind that rewrites a species. In 1992, psychiatrist Judith Herman published a study on trauma survivors. She found that the human mind, when confronted with an experience too overwhelming to process, does not remember it clearly. It fractures the memory, buries it, replaces it with symbols, with images that are safer to hold. A child who survives abuse does not remember the event as a linear narrative. They remember the smell of a room, the color of a wall, a sound that has no context. The mind protects itself by erasing the structure of the memory, leaving only fragments, pieces that can be carried without breaking the person who carries them. Now scale that to a species. Imagine an event so vast, so incomprehensible, that no human alive has the framework to explain it. The sky changes color. The sun moves for the first time. The stars shift. The ground shakes. The seas rise. Everyone you know is gone. The world you trusted is gone. How do you remember that? You do not accurately. You remember a flood, a tower that fell, a garden you were cast out of, gods who were angry, a serpent, a fruit, a ladder that broke. You remember in symbols, and those symbols become the myths we inherit, not as history, but as the psychological wreckage of a species that survived the unsurvivable and had no language for what it had seen. This is not metaphor. This is clinical trauma response at a civilizational scale. But there were those who tried to remember. In every culture, there was a priest class, a caste of scholars, astronomers, record keepers, whose job was to preserve the knowledge of what came before. In Egypt, they were the priests of Heliopolis. In Babylon, the scribes of Eridu. In India, the Brahmin lineages who memorized the Vedas across millennia. And they did not write down everything. They encoded it. Because knowledge of the sky change was dangerous, not to the people, but to the structures of power that relied on stability. If the population knew that the world had ended once, they might begin to ask uncomfortable questions. They might resist. They might refuse to build the temples and pay the taxes and fight the wars that keep empires running. So the knowledge was hidden, not destroyed, hidden, wrapped in allegory, buried in numerical codes, written into the dimensions of sacred architecture, so that only those who knew how to read the measurements would understand what was being said. The Great Pyramid of Giza encodes the speed of light in its dimensional ratios, not approximately, exactly. The number 299,792,458, the speed of light in meters per second, is embedded in the relationship between the pyramid's height and base perimeter. Why? Why would a Bronze Age civilization encode a constant of physics they should not have known into a monument supposedly built as a tomb, unless it was not a tomb, unless it was a library? A message written in stone for those who would come after. A way of saying, we knew things, we lost them. Here is proof we were not primitive. The same pattern appears in Angkor Wat, in Teotihuacan, in the Parthenon. Across the globe, sacred architecture encodes information that should not exist in those time periods: astronomical constants, precessional cycles, the exact dimensions of the earth, not as decoration, as testimony. If you measure these structures yourself, if you stand in the cold shadow of the Great Pyramid at dawn and run your hands along the casing stones, feeling the precision of joints so tight a razor blade cannot fit between them, you will understand that this was not primitive. This was not trial and error. This was the work of people who knew the world had ended once and were determined to leave a record that could survive the next ending. Not in words, in stone, because stone does not burn, stone does not rot, stone does not forget. And then there's the Great Library of Alexandria. You know the story, the fire, the loss, hundreds of thousands of scrolls reduced to ash and smoke, the greatest repository of ancient knowledge destroyed in a single event. But there is something we do not talk about. The library did not burn all at once. It died slowly, across centuries, through deliberate, systematic removal of dangerous texts. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BCE destroyed part of it. The Christian purges under Theophilus in 391 CE destroyed more. The final blow came in the 7th century, but by then most of the truly ancient material, the texts from before the flood, the pre-dynastic records, the Sumerian archives, were already gone. Not lost, removed. Because those texts described a world that contradicted the official narrative. They described stars in the wrong positions. They described a sun that did not move. They described Catastrophes that the new powers, Roman, Christian, Islamic, could not afford to have the population believe in. Empires are built on the promise of permanence. If you want people to obey, to pay taxes, to die in your wars, you must convince them that the world is stable, that the gods are in control, that the sky will not betray them. The old texts said otherwise, so they were erased, and what remained were the copies, the edited versions, the myths stripped of their astronomical detail and rewritten as moral parables. The flood becomes a punishment for sin. The fall of the tower becomes a lesson in hubris. The death of Saturn becomes the overthrow of a tyrant god. Safe versions, versions that do not threaten the order. If you could read the catalog of the Library of Alexandria before it burned, if such a catalog even still existed, you would find titles we have only heard whispers of. The Book of Thoth, the Writings of Enoch, the Chronicle of Akakor, texts that claimed to preserve pre-flood knowledge, texts that described the sky before the change. Now they are dust, or they are hidden in vaults we are not allowed to see, or they were never destroyed at all, just moved. Let us talk about the resistance, because even in our time, especially in our time, there are those who tried to tell this story and were silenced. Immanuel Velikovsky published Worlds in Collision in 1950. The book argued that planetary upheaval had shaped human history within recorded time, that Venus was a rogue object that nearly collided with Earth, that the myths were not myths, they were eyewitness accounts. The academic response was not debate, it was annihilation. Astronomers threatened Velikovsky's publisher with boycotts. The book was dropped despite being a bestseller. Velikovsky was barred from speaking at universities. His name became a slur. Velikovskyan meant crackpot, pseudoscientist, Wei-Xian thinker. Not because he was wrong, because he was dangerous. Because if Velikovsky was right, then the entire framework of gradualism, the idea that the Earth changes slowly, predictably, safely, collapsed. And gradualism is the foundation of institutional authority. Geology, archaeology, evolutionary biology, all of it rests on the assumption that catastrophes are rare, that the past is stable, that we can predict the future based on the patterns of the past. If the sky can change overnight, none of that is true. So Velikovsky was destroyed, not his arguments, his reputation. And the method worked. For 70 years, no mainstream scientist dared touch the topic until the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. In 2007, a team of scientists, led by Richard Firestone, proposed that a comet impact 12,800 years ago triggered the Younger Dryas cooling event and the megafauna extinctions. The evidence was overwhelming. Nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, a thin black layer of sediment across multiple continents. The response was the same: ridicule, rejection, accusations of poor methodology. For 15 years, the hypothesis was fought at every turn, not with evidence, but with institutional pressure. Careers were threatened, papers were rejected, funding was denied. And then in 2022, the evidence became undeniable. The impact was real. The catastrophe happened, and every scientist who had spent 15 years denying it had to quietly update their position while pretending they had never doubted. But here is what they will not admit. If a comet impact can be denied for 15 years, despite clear evidence, what else has been denied? What other catastrophes have we refused to see because they threaten the narrative of stability? What if the Younger Dryas impact was not the cause, but a symptom? A secondary event triggered by the gravitational chaos of Earth's capture into a new solar orbit. You will not find that question in the journals, because the journals are not designed to ask questions that destabilize the foundation. They are designed to protect it. So, how much have we forgotten? Not just Saturn, not just the purple sky, but the entire shape of what came before. We call the period before 10,000 BCE prehistory, as if it were a void, as if nothing happened, as if humans lived in caves, grunting and hunting, waiting for civilization to spontaneously appear in Sumer and Egypt. But Göbekli Tepe is 11,000 years old, and it was not built by cave dwellers. The level of organization, the astronomical knowledge, the artistic sophistication, it rivals anything built in the Bronze Age. And then it was buried, deliberately, as if the builders knew that what they had witnessed should not be remembered. What else was buried? How many other sites lie under the silt of the flood, under the jungles of the Amazon, under the sands of the Sahara, sites that would rewrite everything we think we know about the timeline of human civilization? And how much of what we call mythology is simply history we have chosen to forget? The answer is we do not know, because we stopped looking. We declared the myths to be primitive superstition and moved on. We built a model of the past that fit the needs of the present and called it science. And anyone who questioned it, Velikovsky, Hancock, Carlson, the plasma physicists, the catastrophists, was exiled, not refuted, exiled. But the stones remain, the alignments that point to nothing, the carvings that depict shapes we have no names for, the maps that show coastlines from a world that should not exist. And the myths remain. Every culture on Earth remembers a flood. Every culture remembers a golden age that ended in fire. Every culture remembers a time when the sky was different, not as poetry, as testimony. And if you are willing to sit with that, if you are willing to imagine a world where the myths are not lies, but fractured memories of something that actually happened, then you must ask the question that terrifies every stable civilization. If it happened once, can it happen again? Not in 1,000 years, not in 1,000,000 years, but tomorrow, because the sky is not eternal, the sun is not permanent, and the fragile configuration of gravity and heat and electromagnetic forces that keeps us alive is only one possibility among infinite catastrophes. We forgot Saturn. What else are we forgetting? And what will our descendants say about us 10,000 years from now when they sift through the wreckage of our cities and find no record of what ended us, only myths about gods who fell from the sky and floods that drowned the world? Will they call us primitive? Will they say we did not know? Or will they understand that we knew, we had always known, but that knowing was too dangerous to carry forward? So we forgot, not as an accident, as a function. If you are still listening, if it is late where you are, and the world is dark, and you are alone with this thought, then you are doing what the myths have always asked us to do. You are remembering. Not for comfort, not for certainty, but because the alternative is to forget again. And we have forgotten enough. Prosser chapter 10, the second forgetting. It is 3 in the morning where I am. I do not know what time it is where you are, but I imagine you, alone in the dark, headphones on, lying in bed or sitting at a window, watching the sky. And I want you to look up now, not later, now. Look at the stars, look at the moon, look at the sun when it rises, if you are still awake. And I want you to ask yourself a question that should be simple, but is not. Is this the first sky you have ever known? Not you, personally, but humanity, our species, the long chain of ancestors who carried us forward from the caves and the floods and the forgetting. Is this the sky they knew, or are we living under a replacement, a second sky that we have learned to trust only because we have forgotten the first? Because that is what this has all been about. Not astronomy, not geology, not even history, memory, and the terrible, fragile fact that memory is not permanent, that civilizations forget, that species forget, that the sky itself can change, and within a handful of generations, no one will remember it was ever different. We forgot Saturn. What are we forgetting now? Let us be clear about what we are claiming. Not that Saturn is our true sun, not that the myths are literal instruction manuals, but that something happened, something vast and traumatic and world ending, that our species survived and then systematically erased from memory because the truth was too destabilizing to carry forward, and that we are doing it again, right now, not with myths, with data, because we live in an age of information, and we believe that means we cannot forget. We have hard drives and cloud servers and databases that store every detail of our lives. We believe we have solved the problem of memory, but we have not. We have only changed the mechanism of forgetting. Consider climate data. We know the earth is warming, we know the ice is melting, we know the seas are rising. The evidence is not hidden. It is published, peer-reviewed, undeniable. And yet, we forget. Not because the data is unavailable, but because the implications are unbearable. If we truly internalized what the data is telling us, that our cities will flood, that our crops will fail, that the stable climate our civilization was built on is ending, we would have to change everything, immediately, radically. So we do not internalize it. We read the reports, we nod, we say, yes, that is concerning. And then we go to work, we pay our mortgages, we plan for futures we know, on some level, will not arrive. This is not stupidity. This is the same function our ancestors performed when they turned the sky change into myths. The same cognitive self-defense that allowed them to plant crops and raise children in a world they knew was not eternal. We forget because we have to, because the alternative is paralysis. But there is a cost. The cost is that we become blind to the patterns. We lose the ability to see catastrophe coming because we have trained ourselves to look away. Our ancestors knew this. That is why they built Göbekli Tepe. That is why they carved the petroglyphs. That is why they encoded astronomical data into the dimensions of temples and pyramids. They were trying to leave a message that could survive the forgetting. They were saying, this happened. Do not let them tell you it did not happen. We were here. We saw the sky change. We survived. And you need to know that survival is possible, but only if you remember. And we did not listen. We called them primitive. We called their monuments tombs and their carvings art and their myths superstition. We looked at the evidence they left and saw only the past, never the warning. Because we believe we are different. We believe that our civilization is special, that we have escaped the cycle of rise and fall that claimed every empire before us, that our technology has made us immune to the forces that shape worlds. But we are not different. We are just living in the space between catastrophes, and that space is narrower than we think. Let me tell you what terrifies me most about the Saturn theory. Not that it might be true, not that the sky changed once and we forgot, but that it reveals a pattern. Civilizations do not end because they lack knowledge. They end because they forget what they know. The Romans knew how to make concrete that would last 2,000 years. We forgot. For 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, no one in Europe could replicate Roman engineering. The knowledge was not lost to fire or flood, it was lost to neglect, to the simple, silent process of one generation failing to teach the next. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single fire, it decayed across centuries because fewer people cared to preserve it, because the new powers had different priorities, because the knowledge it contained no longer served the needs of the present. The Maya had a writing system, one of only 5 independently invented in human history, and then they stopped using it, not because they were conquered, not because they went extinct, but because the knowledge became irrelevant to the survivors. Within a few generations, no one could read the glyphs. The history written on every temple wall became decoration. This is the pattern. Knowledge does not survive unless it is actively maintained, unless each generation believes it is worth the cost of preservation. And in times of crisis, in the aftermath of catastrophe, preservation is a luxury. Survival comes first, so the knowledge is lost, and the next civilization starts over, unaware that they are rebuilding on the ruins of something greater. We are doing it now, not with the sky, with everything. We are losing languages at a rate of 1 every 2 weeks. Each one carries knowledge, botanical, ecological, historical, that exists nowhere else. When the last speaker dies, that knowledge dies. We are losing topsoil. The thin layer of earth that allows us to grow food is eroding faster than it forms. Industrial agriculture is mining the soil, extracting nutrients that took millennia to accumulate. In 50 years, maybe less, the soil will be gone. And we know this. The data is clear. The warnings are published. The scientists are begging us to pay attention. And we are scrolling past it. We are living our lives as if the world is stable, as if the soil will regenerate, as if the languages do not matter, as if the knowledge we are losing is not the foundation of everything we depend on. We are forgetting in real time. And our descendants, if there are descendants, will sift through our ruins and ask the same question future archaeologists asked about Rome, about the Maya, about every collapsed civilization. How did they not see it coming? The answer is, we saw it. We saw it perfectly. We just could not afford to believe it. So what do? Not collectively, individually. You, me, the person listening to this at 3 a.m., unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, wondering if any of this matters. We remember? Not as an act of nostalgia, not as a retreat into the past, but as an act of defiance against the function of forgetting. We look at the myths and see them not as superstition, but as testimony. We look at the stones and see them not as decoration, but as evidence. We look at the sky and understand that it is not eternal, that everything we trust is contingent, temporary, one configuration among infinite possibilities. And we carry that knowledge forward, not to paralyze ourselves, but to wake ourselves up, because the alternative is to sleepwalk into the next catastrophe, convinced that it cannot happen to us, that we are special, that our sky is the only sky there has ever been. But it is not. It is the second sky. And if we forget that, if we allow the knowledge of the first sky to fade completely, then we will not see the third sky coming. I think about the people who built Göbekli Tepe. They had survived something we cannot imagine. The sky had changed, the world had ended, everyone they knew was gone, and instead of giving up, instead of retreating into the caves and waiting to die, they built. They carved pillars, they aligned them to the stars. They encoded their knowledge into stone so that someone someday might understand what they had seen. They did not know if anyone would ever read their message. They did not know if their civilization would survive another generation. But they built it anyway, not for themselves, for us. And we did not listen. We called it a temple. We called it primitive. We dated it and cataloged it and moved on. But the message is still there, carved into the stone, aligned to the stars, waiting. And the message is this: the sky can change, the world can end, but survival is possible. Remember, remember, remember. If you are still listening, then you are part of the chain now. You are one of the people who chose not to forget, who looked at the evidence and saw not just the past, but the warning, who understood that the sky is not permanent and the world is not stable, and that every certainty we cling to is only a temporary arrangement of forces that could collapse tomorrow. This is not meant to terrify you. It is meant to wake you up, because we are living in the space between catastrophes. The old world ended 10,000 years ago. The new world, our world, is ending now. Not in fire and flood, but in soil loss and language death, and the slow, silent erosion of the knowledge that keeps us alive. And the question is not whether we can stop it. The question is whether we can remember it, whether we can leave a message for the survivors, whoever they are, whenever they come, that says, we knew, we saw it happening, we tried. Not carved in stone this time, but written in the choices we make, in the knowledge we preserve, in the stories we tell our children about the fragility of the world and the impermanence of the sky. So look up, look at the stars, look at the sun, and understand that they are not eternal, that this sky, this blue, daylit, rotating sky, is not the first sky humanity has known. It is the second sky, and it will not be the last. Not because the cosmos is cruel, but because the cosmos is some indifferent, because stability is the exception, not the rule, because everything that exists is only a temporary constellation of forces that will eventually come undone. Our ancestors knew this. They watched their sky die and their world drown, and they survived. They carried the memory forward in the only way they could, in myths and monuments and the shapes they carved into stone, and then we forgot. We called their testimony superstition. We called their evidence decoration. We looked at the ruins of their world and saw only primitives who did not know what we know, but they knew what we have forgotten, that the world is fragile, that the sky can change, that survival depends not on certainty, but on the ability to remember that nothing is certain. It is almost dawn where I am. The sky is beginning to pale, not purple, blue, the blue of the second sky, the sky we have learned to trust. and I wonder what color the third sky will be. I wonder if there will be anyone left to see it, if there will be anyone left to carve the warning into stone, if the survivors will look at our ruins, our skyscrapers and our satellites and our databases full of forgotten data, and ask the same question we asked about Göbekli Tepe. What were they trying to tell us? I hope they figure it out. I hope they see the pattern. I hope they understand that we knew the world was ending and that we tried, however imperfectly, to leave a message, not in stone this time, but in these words, in the stories we tell in the dark, in the conversations we have at 3 a.m. when the world is sleeping, and the only ones awake are the ones willing to remember. Tell me in the comments what you see when you look at the sky tonight. Tell me if it looks different now. Tell me if you can imagine, just for a moment, what it would feel like to watch it change. To wake up one morning and see a sun you have never seen before, a color you have never known, a sky that is not the sky you trusted, because it happened once and it will happen again, not as myth, not as metaphor, but as the slow, inevitable unraveling of every stable thing we have built our lives upon. The first sky died 10,000 years ago, and we forgot. The second sky is dying now, and we are forgetting in real time. The question is not whether we can stop it. The question is whether we can remember it long enough to leave a message for the third sky, for the survivors, for whoever comes after. Not as a warning, as a memory,